All right, guys, so we're going to go ahead and start doing some problems from chapter 1.2 and 1.4. This is going to be for the first tutoring session for the term. Okay, and I'm going to be using some of the problems from those chapters. They come in the book. And this is pretty much what it's going to be looking like, okay? So I'm sharing right now my screen. Started with some absolute value problems. Okay, so just remember what the definition for absolute value means. And that is how far is that number, the given number, from the zero. Okay, so if I have some absolute value bars, that means that I'm going to take that absolute value operation there. Okay, so absolute value of 13 is going to be the same as that number without any sign. The same will happen if the absolute value was for a negative number, something like absolute value of negative 13. The result will also be 13. So that's how far is this number, the given number, from the zero. How many units is that far? Is that apart from the zero? Okay, so in this case, I will select my first answer. That will be 13. Okay, so the second example over here will be an absolute value of a negative number. So what's going to happen in that situation is the exact same thing. Okay, so taking the absolute value of a number is pretty much showing how far is this number from the zero. Okay, so negative 1.9 is 1.9 units apart from the zero. Pretty much the number without a sign. Okay, so my answer will be 1.9 on this other problem. Okay, those are simple problems. So what happens if I have a negative sign outside the absolute value bars? Okay, so if I have a negative sign outside the absolute value bars, that negative sign is not applying in this absolute value bars rule. Okay, that's independent from the operation. So first of all, the absolute value of negative 13, that will be 13 because negative 13 is 13 units apart from the zero, or just a number without the sign. And then I also have an extra negative sign outside that has to be carried over. So this is going to be one of those situations where the result is negative because of the sign outside. So this sign outside the absolute value bars does not disappear. The one inside, it does disappear because we're talking about just the magnitude, not the direction. So how far is the negative 13 from the zero? Okay, and that is 13 units, but I'm selecting the negative 13 because I have that extra sign that I was talking about. Okay, so the absolute value of negative 13 is going to be 13, and then add that negative sign. Okay, so we should choose negative 13. Okay, let me get a new set of problems here. What is absolute value good for? Or are we going to use the concept of absolute value? Okay, and this is for additions of numbers that have, positive signs, negative signs, combination of these different signs. So for example, negative 12 plus negative 14. Okay, so negative 12 plus negative 14. The rule for adding real numbers, it's always going to be depending on the sign that you have in the middle. Okay, so that's a plus sign. That means addition of those two numbers. And I'm adding two negative numbers, and there's a rule for adding two numbers that have the same sign. And this is going to be take the absolute values. So you just think about the numbers without any sign. And then you're going to add up those numbers and then give them the common sign. Okay, so if I take the absolute values, which are 12 and 14, I will have to add those two numbers. And then the result is going to carry over the sign of the common sign in that case. Okay, which happens to be negative. And then just 12 plus 14, that's going to be 26. Okay, so that's going to be my answer for the first question. Over here, that's negative 26. Take two numbers, add the absolute values, 12 and 14, and then give them the common sign. On the next example, something different is going to happen. Since I have two numbers that have different signs, I have a negative 15 and I have a positive 8. So what I have to do is I have to still take the absolute values. So the absolute values are 15 and 8. And since they have originally different signs, I am going to subtract those, and the result is going to carry over the sign of whichever quantity was larger. So in this case, I have negative 15 and positive 8. I know 15 is larger, So the result is going to carry over this sign over here, the negative sign. So 15 minus 8, that gotta be 7. And then the sign of the result has to be of that one with the number on the number that's larger. Okay, so negative 7 should be my second result over here. Okay, two different rules for two numbers that have the same sign, or for two numbers that have the different sign. For two numbers that have the same sign, you have to add them up, and then give them the common sign. And two numbers with different signs, you have to subtract them and give them the sign of the largest number. Okay, so let's see a little bit more, some more examples in here. Okay, we are adding negative 3 plus negative 23. Okay, so those are two numbers with a negative sign. That means that I have to add those up. 3 plus 23, and the result is 26. And then they have to have the common sign. So they're both negative, means I'm going to carry over the negative sign. Okay, so this should be my result, negative 26. Okay, for the next example, now I have two numbers that have different signs, negative 8 plus positive 11, or negative 8 plus 11. So that means that I have to take the absolute values, so the numbers without the signs. That's 11 and 8. And I will have to subtract those two numbers. Okay, 11 minus 8, because they have different signs. And the result is going to have that sign of whichever number was larger originally, right? So I have a negative 8 and I have a positive 11. So it has to have the sign of the 11. That's the largest number. Okay, so do the subtraction first. That should be 3. And then I'm going to carry over the sign of the largest quantity. Okay, so it's going to be positive 3. Okay, this is for additions. This is how to add real numbers. Of course, I mean, it's really simple to add two positive numbers, right? As in 2 plus 5, or 2 plus 6, or 3 plus 10. If both of those are positive, then it's going to be really simple to add, right? But what happens when we have, two negatives and we're adding two negatives, or when we have a positive and a negative and we're adding those numbers? So these are pretty much the rules that we're going to be following. Okay. We get a new set of examples here. Okay, when the problem says find negative x is a written way to request the opposite. Okay, so if it says find negative x, we're trying to find the opposite of the given number. In this case, the given number is negative 11. So the opposite is going to be the opposite sign. Okay, in absolute value, you have to get rid of the sign, right? When you have your absolute value bars, you get rid of the sign. But when you're thinking about negative x, or the opposite, you have to switch the sign. So the opposite of negative 11 in this case will be positive 11, right? And the opposite of negative 10 will be positive 10, right? If I were to find the opposite of positive 8, then that would be negative 8, right? If I were to find the opposite of positive, whatever value you want to think of, right? Positive a, then the opposite is negative a. You gotta change the signs. Okay, so that is going to be for opposites, and I'm going to use this concept of opposites for subtractions. Okay, for subtractions. Let me get a new set of problems here. Okay. Subtractions, they're going to use the concept of opposites in order to be performed. Okay, so again, simple subtractions like 10 minus 2, that's 8, that's super simple, right? 15 minus 3, that's going to be 12. Those are simple subtractions. But what happens when I'm subtracting a negative number from another negative number, or a negative number from a positive number, or a large negative from a short positive, right? So what am I going to do here? So this is going to be the rule. It's going to be a subtraction if I have this negative sign in between those two numbers. Okay, so that's going to be a subtraction. And that means that I have to get the opposite of this number, the second item, right? That's a negative sign. I need to get the opposite of the second item, and the opposite will be changing signs. And then I'm just going to perform a regular addition. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to write my first number, which is negative 14, and I'm going to convert this into an addition, okay, of the opposite of the number that I just circled. So that's what subtraction means. The opposite of negative 12 is going to be positive 12. Okay, and now we know how to do additions and subtractions. Okay, so what is negative 14 plus 12? I'm doing this addition. I have to get the absolute values. Okay, 14 and 12, the numbers without the signs. And then I have to subtract them since they have different signs. Okay, the numerical value is 2. And what's going to be the sign? Is it positive or negative? You look at the addition, whichever is larger, that is the sign that's going to be carried over. Okay, so negative 2. And for the bottom example, the same thing. My first number is negative 8. I have a negative sign in there, means I have to convert that into a plus and the opposite of the number that is circled. Okay, and the opposite of negative 7 happens to be positive 7. Now that it became an addition, I'm going to be able to add it with the rules that we already discussed. Okay, so negative 8 plus 7, they have different signs. I still have to get the absolute values, 8 and 7. I have to subtract those two numbers since they have the different signs. The result is going to be 1. And then I have to give it the sign of whichever number was larger. So in this case, I have negative 8 and positive 7. The negative is the larger, that's an 8. So the result should be negative 1. Okay, so that's my negative 1. And over here on the top, that's my negative 2. Okay, let me get some more problems here. Subtractions. Now we're going to get multiplications. Okay, multiplications or repeated multiplications. So the rules for multiplication, they are different than the rules for additions and subtractions. Okay, so rule for multiplication says that if I'm multiplying two numbers that have different signs, as in a negative times a positive, then the result is going to be a negative number. The same as if I multiply a positive or a negative, right? As long as they are different signs, then the result is going to be negative regardless of the magnitude. Okay, and on the other hand, if I have a negative number times a negative number, or a positive number times a positive number, the result is always going to be positive. So if you're multiplying equal signs, then the result becomes positive. If you're multiplying different signs, then the result is negative. On this first example, I have the example of an exponent. That little 2 in there means that I'm going to do repeated multiplication of the base, the big number in the parentheses. So negative 4 to the power of 2 is the same thing as negative 4 times itself 2 times, as in this exponent. Okay, so that means negative 4 times negative 4. Those are two negative numbers. The result is going to be positive for sure. We are multiplying those. And 4 times 4 is 16. Okay, so my first result should be 16. That's a repeated multiplication. Let's go ahead and do the next multiplication. Okay, first of all, I have a negative number and a positive number. Right away, I know this result is going to be negative without even doing the multiplication. Okay, and since I have some zeros in there involved in the multiplication, I can just add those zeros at the end, add or multiply the non-zero digits and then add an equal amount of zeros as you have on those factors. Okay, so 3 times 4, that's going to be 12. And then I have two zeros that are multiplying in there. That means that I can just follow the 12 with two zeros. Okay, so 30 times 40, that's going to be 1200. And that's choice is going to be here because that's a negative. It has to be a negative because we have a negative number times a positive number. Okay, so that's a little bit about multiplication. What happens when I have different numbers or several numbers multiplying, not only two factors? Okay, that's fine. You can do those one by one. Okay, so 3 times negative 1 times 7 times negative 2. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to multiply the first two factors. Okay, so 3 times negative 1, and then later on I'll multiply times 7 and times negative 2. So 3 times negative 1, two numbers with different signs, that means negative result. And 3 times 1 is 3. I still have to multiply times 7 and times negative 2. And that's what I'm going to do next. Negative 3 times 7, that's negative 21. And I still have to multiply that times negative 2. Okay. And the negative 21 times negative 2, those are two negative numbers. When you multiply these two, you're going to get a positive result. And you just multiply the magnitudes. So 21 times 2, that should be 42. So this is the number that I'm looking for, positive 42. Okay. So using the order of operations to perform to simplify expressions. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the first one, right? Remember that the order of operations is going to tell me the only correct way to perform this operation. And there's a mnemonic that we call PEMDAS. Okay, so we follow this mnemonic: P as in operations inside parentheses, E as in exponents, M as in multiplications, D as in divisions, A as in additions, and S as in subtractions. Then we're going to get the correct result. Okay, so from left to right, as we start, we don't have any parentheses. Okay, we don't have any exponents. We do have one multiplication, and we also have one division. Okay, so the rule at this point for multiplications and divisions says that I have to do whichever of those happens first from left to right. Multiplications and divisions, they belong to the same family. So whatever happens first left to right has to be done first. So I have two options. I have a 0 divided by 3, and I also have a 6 times 4. So from left to right, I will have to perform the division first, because that's what comes first on this category of multiplications and divisions. Okay, let me write my expression again. 6 times 4. I will do the division first, which is 0 divided by 3. And 0 divided by 3 is 0. And then I can go ahead and do the multiplication. So 6 times 4, that's 24. And then if I keep going on PEMDAS, I can go ahead and do the addition. So 0 plus 24, that's going to be 24. That is the answer that I'm looking for. That's the correct answer. Okay. So let's go ahead and do the same thing for the next order of operations. Okay. I'm still going to be following PEMDAS. I don't have any operations inside the parentheses. You might see that there's a negative 13 in here, but that is not an operation. That is just a number with a negative sign. Okay, an operation will be something that looks like 5 plus 3 inside a parenthesis, or a multiplication, 10 times 2, or even a division, right? So 5 divided by 3. All of those are operations inside a parenthesis. Those will have to be done first. But right now we don't have any. So we're going to move to the next category, which is exponents. And it looks like we don't have exponents either. Now I'm going to do multiplications and divisions from left to right, whatever happens first. Okay, and I see that I have two operations in here. I have a negative 5 times a positive 4. And I also have a 182 divided by negative 13. So what I'm going to do first is going to be the multiplication, because that's happening first left to right. Okay, so let me write my expression again. Times 4 plus 182 divided by negative 13. Okay, so this is the first operation that I'm going to be doing, the multiplication left to right. So negative 5 times 4, that's going to be negative 20. And then I also have a division here to do. Okay, 182 divided by 13. Okay, that's the next step. That's the next thing that I have to do. So we'll go ahead and do it. Okay. This is the operation that I'm doing. So if you divide a positive number with a negative number, you are going to get a negative result, just like the same rules for multiplication. Okay, so if I take 182 and divide it by negative 13, I know the result is going to be a negative number. And if you do the magnitudes, 182 divided by 13, you should get 14 here. Okay, we're done with multiplications and divisions. We move to additions and subtractions left to right. So I'm going to go ahead and perform 65 minus 20, which happens to be 45. And then we're going to do 45 minus 14, okay, which happens to be 31. And that is the answer that I'm looking for, 31. The last set of problems from chapter 1.2 that I'm going to cover right now are going to be the introduction to 1.4. Is going to be the first step into solving expressions or simplifying expressions to later on used for solving equations. Okay, so simplify the algebraic expressions. This takes some steps that are a little bit different than PEMDAS. Okay, and we're always going to start by removing the parentheses. That's always going to be the first step. Okay, removing the grouping symbols. And how am I going to remove the grouping symbols when I have an algebraic expression? By distributing whatever is in front of those symbols. So in this case, for the first example, I'm going to write it again. For the first parenthesis, it looks like I have a 3 in front of it. So I will have to do distributive property, 3 times 5x and 3 times -4. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. The first distributive property, get rid of the parentheses. Okay, so 3 times 5x is going to be 15x. And then 3 times -4, that's going to be -12. That's getting rid of the first parenthesis. Then I do have a second parenthesis that has a -4 in front of it. So I'm going to do the same thing, -4 times x and -4 times -1. Okay, so as the next step, -4 times x, that's -4x. And -4 times -1, that's going to be +4. Okay, getting rid of the parentheses first. And then the second step is always going to be combining like terms. And what are like terms? What are the terms that I can combine? Terms that have the same variable, those I can combine. And also numbers that don't have any variable, I can also combine them into one only term using the rules of additions and subtractions. Okay, so for the first two letters, or the 15x minus 4x, all I'm going to do is 15 minus 4. Okay, and 15 minus 4, this happens to be 11. And I'm going to keep the x in there because 15x as in 15 apples minus 4x as in 4 apples is going to be 11x as in 11 apples. Okay, so you do have to include the unit or the variable that you're talking about. So 11x as the first part, and I have to also combine like terms on the number. So -12 plus 4. So this is an operation that we have already done right now. Okay, -12 plus 4, that's two numbers with different signs. I have to take the absolute values and subtract them. And then the result is going to have the sign of whichever number is larger. So since -12 is larger, this result has to be -8. And that is the result of combining -12 plus 4. And this is the result that I'm looking for as a simplified expression. Okay, so beyond this case, now you cannot combine those two into one only term. The first 11x, those are 11 apples, and this -8 is like $8. Okay, so it doesn't matter how much you want to combine those, you're never going to be able to get those into the same term, into one only term. Okay, so that's how it's going to stay, 11x minus 8. Okay, let's take a look at the next example. I do have a parenthesis that I have to get rid of. Remember that these are slightly different steps than PEMDAS. So the first thing to get rid of is going to be the grouping symbols, not the operations inside grouping symbols, but the grouping symbols themselves. Okay, and this is going to be the first grouping symbol that I have there, -5 times 2x minus 6. Okay, let me write my expression again for x plus 10. So -5 times 2x, that's going to be -10x. And then -5 times -6 is going to be +30. Okay, and everything else remains the same. Now I can move into combining like terms. Okay, so -10x and -4x, those are going to be able to be combined into one only term. -10 plus -4, there's two numbers, they have the same sign. I still have to get the absolute values. I have to add those up since they have the same sign, and then give them the common sign. On this case, they're both negative. So the result ends up being -14x. And then I can also combine these numbers over here. Okay, +30 plus 10. That is combining those two numbers. 30 plus 10, excuse me, is going to be 40. And remember that x's and numbers by themselves, you're not going to be able to combine those. Okay, so I'm looking for -14x plus 40. Looks like the first option in here. Okay, so this is going to be it for the topics on 1.2. I'm also going to work some topics from 1.4 in a second. Okay, So let me go ahead and open the topic for 1.4. And I think I'm just going to start this on the different video, just so that we can separate those by chapters. Okay, so I'm going to start a new video. Thank you very much for watching.